My name is Jessica. I am 32 years old and I work as a bookkeeper. 3 weeks ago, right in the middle of a crowded country club, my older brother snatched a $145,000 check out of my hands and hissed, "Hand it over. Family comes first." When I refused, his hand cracked across my face, silencing the entire room. But he did not realize our grandpa was watching, holding a stack of legal documents that would cost my brother his house, his cars, and his freedom, while leaving our parents completely bankrupt. Before I tell you exactly what was in those papers and how we made him pay, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. But only if you truly support stories where toxic families get exactly what they deserve. Also, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. The smell of my mother's famous pot roast was usually a sign of comfort. That night, it was the bait for a trap. I walked into the house my parents Richard and Susan had owned for 30 years. It was a sprawling suburban colonial filled with heavy mahogany furniture and perfectly arranged family portraits. Most of those portraits featured my older brother Brandon. He was 34, tall, wearing a designer suit without a tie, and constantly reminding everyone that he was a highly successful real estate investor. I was the reliable, invisible daughter who balanced ledgers and drove a 10-year-old sedan. I had barely taken off my coat when Brandon tossed a thick stack of stapled papers onto the glass coffee table. The thud made me jump. I looked at the papers, then at Brandon, and then at his wife Brittany, who was sitting on the sofa inspecting her manicured nails. "What is this?" I asked. Brandon smiled. The kind of smile a car salesman gives you before pushing a terrible deal. "It is a guarantor application, Jessica. Brittany needs a new car. Her current SUV is 3 years old, and it is starting to look dated when we pull up to the country club. We are upgrading her to the new luxury model. Fully loaded. $85,000. I stared at him, genuinely confused. "Okay," I said. "Congratulations. Why is the application on the table in front of me?" My mother Susan stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine dish towel. "Your brother had a slight hiccup with his credit score recently," she said smoothly, as if she were talking about a minor weather delay. "He is moving a lot of capital around right now for his massive real estate deals. His cash is tied up in investments. The dealership is being completely unreasonable about his debt-to-income ratio." Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They want a co-signer, Jessica. Just a formality. You are a bookkeeper. You have no debt, no mortgage, and an 800 credit score. You just sign on the dotted line and Brittany gets to drive her car home tomorrow. I will make all the payments, obviously." I looked down at the paperwork. I knew exactly what a guarantor application meant. In my line of work, I saw the financial ruin these documents caused every single day. If Brandon missed a payment, the bank would come after me. If the car was repossessed, my pristine credit score would be destroyed. And Brandon was notoriously bad with money. Despite his flashy suits and his constant bragging about his real estate empire, he always seemed to be dodging calls from creditors. "No," I said. The single word hung in the air. Brittany stopped looking at her nails. Brandon's smile vanished. My mother froze in the doorway. "What do you mean, no, my father?" Richard grumbled from his leather recliner. He lowered his newspaper and glared at me. "Your brother is asking for a simple favor." "It is not a simple favor, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice as calm and professional as possible. "It is an $85,000 legal liability. If Brandon is doing as well as he claims, he does not need me to vouch for him. And if his credit is too damaged to finance a car, then he definitely should not be buying an $85,000 luxury vehicle." Brandon stood up, his face flushing red. "It is a cash flow issue, Jessica. You would not understand. You sit in a cubicle all day punching numbers into a spreadsheet for small-time clients. I am out there making high-level deals. I need liquid capital for my next property acquisition. I am not going to tie up my cash in a depreciating asset." "Then let Brittany keep her current car," I countered. "It is only 3 years old." Brittany scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. I cannot drive clients around in a 3-year-old car, Jessica. It is embarrassing. We have an image to maintain. You would not get it considering you still drive that ancient clunker from college. I felt my blood temperature rise, but I kept my posture straight. My ancient clunker is fully paid off, Brittany, and it gets me to work just fine. I am not signing this document. I will not put my financial future on the line for a luxury car. My mother marched into the living room, her face tight with sudden rage. Jessica, I cannot believe how selfish you are being right now. Your brother is a successful entrepreneur. He provides for his wife. He is building a legacy. You are a bookkeeper. You have no children. You have no husband. You sit in your tiny one-bedroom apartment hoarding your paychecks. What do you even need an 800 credit score for? The words felt like a physical blow. Hoarding my paychecks. I lived modestly because I had to. I had paid my own way through college without a single dime from my parents while they had handed Brandon a down payment for his first house. I saved every extra dollar I earned because I knew I was my only safety net. If I fell, no one in this room would catch me. I am not hoarding, Mom. I said, my voice trembling slightly before I forced it back into a steady rhythm. I am being responsible. And part of being responsible is not signing legal contracts for debt I cannot afford. Brandon sneered, walking around the coffee table until he was standing inches from my face. You are just jealous, he spat. You have always been jealous of me. You are miserable and alone, and you cannot stand the fact that I have a beautiful wife, a 5,000 square foot house in the best neighborhood, and a life you could never afford. You are trying to sabotage me because you are petty. I looked him right in the eye. If your life is so spectacular, Brandon, why are you begging your little sister to secure your auto loan? His jaw clenched. For a second, I thought he might actually hit me right then and there. His hands balled into fists at his sides. My father slammed his newspaper down and stood up. That is enough, Richard shouted. You will treat your brother with respect in this house. He is family. Family helps family. When you have an asset, you share it. Your credit score is a family asset right now, and you are going to use it to help Brandon. My credit score is not a family asset. I fired back, my voice finally rising. I built it. I earned it. Neither of you helped me pay my student loans. Neither of you helped me pay my rent when I lost my job 3 years ago. I built my life from scratch, and I'm not going to let Brandon destroy it so Brittany can impress her country club friends. My mother let out a loud theatrical sob. Where did we go wrong with you? She cried, burying her face in her hands. We raised you to love your family. We raised you to be supportive. But you are just cold. You are a cold, calculating, selfish spinster. You care more about numbers on a computer screen than you care about your own flesh and blood. The room went completely silent after she said it. Spinster, selfish, cold. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Yet here they were emotionally attacking me, tearing down my life choices, insulting my relationship status, and dismissing my hard work, all because I refused to be a financial sacrifice for their golden boy. I looked at my mother, who was peeking through her fingers to see if her performance was working. I looked at my father, who was glaring at me with utter disappointment. I looked at Brittany, who was rolling her eyes, annoyed that the attention was not on her car anymore. And finally I looked at Brandon. He was smirking. He thought he had won. He thought the combined weight of my family's guilt trip would force me to break just like it always did when we were kids. But I was not a kid anymore. I was a professional woman who understood exactly what was at stake. I reached down and picked up my purse. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just looked at my brother and delivered the absolute truth. I am not signing your application, Brandon. And if you ask me again, I will leave, and I will not come back. Brandon scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Go ahead and leave, Jessica. Run back to your empty little apartment. But just remember, when you are old and alone, do not come crying to us for help. We are the only family you have. I turned toward the door. I do not need this kind of family, I said quietly. As I walked down the hallway, my father shouted after me. If you walk out that door, Jessica, do not bother coming to Sunday dinners anymore. You are dead to us until you learn how to support your brother. I grabbed the doorknob. The smell of the pot roast lingered in the air, a sickening reminder of the warmth and comfort I had hoped to find tonight. Instead, I had found a firing squad. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing down the quiet suburban street. I walked to my 10-year-old sedan, the car Brittany had just openly mocked. I got in, gripped the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of betrayal. The foundational crack in my relationship with my family had just split wide open. They had shown me their true colors. I was not a daughter or a sister to them. I was a resource, a tool to be used, a credit score to be harvested. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving their massive house behind me. I thought the worst of the drama was over. I thought setting this boundary would be the end of it. I had no idea that Brandon's demand for a co-signer was just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. I had no idea that the real crisis was already brewing, a crisis involving my grandfather, a massive sum of money, and a dark secret that Brandon was desperately trying to hide. The war had not ended with me walking out that door. In fact, it had only just begun. I started the engine of my old sedan, the mechanical hum grounding me as I pulled out of Grandpa William's driveway. The encounter with Brandon played on a continuous loop in my mind. The frantic pacing, the sudden unhinged aggression, the sheer desperation vibrating off him when he demanded my inheritance. None of it aligned with the image of a thriving real estate mogul. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight. Brandon was hiding something massive, and whatever it was terrifying him. A man flush with capital does not corner his little sister to extort her trust fund. A man closing high-level commercial acquisitions does not resort to physical intimidation over $145,000. He was drowning, and he viewed my check as his life raft. Over the next few days, I threw myself entirely into my bookkeeping work, using the numbers to keep my anxiety at bay. I avoided all calls from my parents, knowing they would only be acting as Brandon's debt collectors, armed with fresh guilt trips about family loyalty. I needed distance. I needed facts. I needed to understand exactly what kind of financial ruin my brother was dragging our family toward. On Wednesday evening, the silence was finally broken. My phone lit up on my kitchen counter. It was a text from my father. "Jessica, we need you to come over tomorrow after work. Your mother's computer is acting up again and she cannot get into her tax software. We have an extension deadline coming up. Do not ignore this. Family helps family." I stared at the screen, a cynical laugh escaping my throat. They had exiled me from Sunday dinners, called me a selfish spinster, and watched my brother threaten me. But the moment they needed free tech support, I was suddenly required to remember that family helps family. My first instinct was to delete the message. I did not owe them my time or my skills. But as I set the phone down, a sudden sharp realization hit me. My parents managed all their household finances from the desktop computer in my father's home office. That same office was where Brandon often sat to discuss his brilliant investment strategies, with my father playing the role of the successful prodigy. If Brandon was hiding a catastrophic financial secret, the evidence might not be in his own meticulously guarded briefcase. It might be sitting right out in the open, scattered among the papers he used to con our parents into believing his lies. I picked up the phone and typed a brief response. "I will be there at 6. The drive to my parents' suburban colonial felt heavier than usual the next day. The sky was overcast, casting a gray, oppressive shadow over the perfectly manicured lawns of their neighborhood. When I pulled up, I noted with a grim sense of satisfaction that Brandon's sports car was nowhere in sight. I needed to get in, fix the computer, look for any discrepancies, and get out before he showed up to resume his intimidation tactics. My mother opened the door before I could even knock. She did not offer a greeting or a hug. She simply pointed toward the hallway. "The computer is in your father's study. I cannot get the program to load the previous year's return. Just fix it quickly. We are having guests for dinner, and I do not want you getting in the way. I nodded, maintaining a professional, detached demeanor. Understood. I will be out of your hair in 20 minutes. I walked down the hall and stepped into my father's study. The room smelled of old paper and the cheap cigars my father refused to give up. The massive mahogany desk was cluttered with mail utility bills and printed receipts. I sat down in his heavy leather chair and woke up the computer monitor. As I waited for the outdated operating system to load, my eyes naturally began scanning the chaotic piles of paper on the desk. It was an occupational hazard. As a bookkeeper, I could not look at a stack of financial documents without automatically searching for patterns, anomalies, and red flags. Near the edge of the desk, partially covered by a stack of junk mail, lay a thick manila folder. It was unmarked, but the edges of several bank statements were protruding from the side. What caught my attention was not the statements themselves, but the logo printed on the top corner of the visible page. It was a high-risk, subprime commercial lending firm. The kind of lender of absolute last resort, notorious for exorbitant interest rates and predatory terms. I glanced at the open doorway. I could hear my mother clattering pots and pans in the kitchen at the other end of the house. I had a few minutes. I reached out and carefully slid the folder out from under the junk mail. I opened it and began to flip through the pages. It took my trained eyes less than 60 seconds to comprehend the absolute devastation printed on those sheets of paper. Brandon was not just struggling with cash flow. He was in complete financial freefall. The statements belonged to Brandon's primary LLC. The accounts were bled dry. Every single corporate credit card was maxed out to the absolute limit. There were notices of default from 3 separate private investors. But the most horrifying documents were buried near the back of the folder. They were IRS tax lien notices. Brandon had not paid payroll taxes or corporate income taxes in over 3 years. The federal government was preparing to seize his business assets. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes and penalties. My breath caught in my throat as I uncovered the final document in the stack. It was a recent statement for a home equity line of credit. A HELOC. I stared at the property address listed on the loan. It was the address of the massive suburban mansion Brandon lived in. The house he constantly bragged about owning. The house he used to prove his superiority over my modest apartment. But I knew the legal truth about that house. Grandpa William had purchased it a decade ago as an investment property. He allowed Brandon and Brittany to live there rent-free, paying only the property taxes and maintenance to help his grandson get on his feet. The deed was entirely unquestionably in Grandpa William's name. Yet here was a bank statement showing a freshly approved HELOC for $250,000 secured against that exact property. The borrower listed on the statement was Brandon. The pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. A bank does not issue a home equity loan to a tenant. They only issue it to the deed holder. For Brandon to secure this loan, he had to have presented the bank with fraudulent documents proving he owned the home. Brandon had forged our grandfather's signature. He had committed mortgage fraud illegally, borrowing $250,000 against a house he did not own to desperately pay off the IRS and his predatory lenders. And now the HELOC payments were due. If he defaulted, the bank would foreclose on the house, and Grandpa William would discover the massive illegal lien placed on his property. That was why Brandon was a cornered animal in the driveway. He did not want my $145,000 to pool our investments. He needed my inheritance to make a lump sum payment to the bank and keep the fraud hidden from Grandpa William for a few more months. I pulled out my phone. My hands remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. I opened the camera app and systematically photographed every single page in that folder. The tax liens, the default notices, the fraudulent HELOC statement, every piece of undeniable ruinous evidence. I carefully placed the folder exactly where I found it, covering it with the junk mail. I turned my attention back to the computer, quickly resolved the software glitch, and shut the system down. I walked out of the study and down the hall. My mother poked her head out of the kitchen. "Is it fixed?" she demanded. "Yes," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "It is fully operational. I am leaving now." I did not wait for a thank you. I walked out to my car, the digital evidence burning a hole in my pocket. I knew what I had to do. I could not confront Brandon. He was desperate enough to do anything. I could not tell my parents. They would undoubtedly try to cover it up and pressure me even harder to surrender my check to save him. There was only one person who needed to see these photos. The man whose signature had been forged, whose property had been violated, and who held the power to destroy Brandon's entire facade. I put my car in gear and drove straight toward Grandpa William's house, ready to initiate a war. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected phone call that I almost let go to voicemail. It was my mother. After the disastrous confrontation over the luxury car loan, I had enjoyed nearly a week of absolute silence from my family. No text messages, no passive-aggressive voicemails, just peace. But when I finally answered her call, Susan did not offer an apology. She did not even ask how I was doing. She simply demanded that I come over immediately after work, because the tax preparation software on my father's desktop computer had frozen, and they had a filing deadline rapidly approaching. I should have said no. I should have told her to call a technical support hotline and let them deal with it. But a strange, quiet instinct urged me to go. I told myself I was just being dutiful, fulfilling the role of the reliable daughter one last time before cutting ties completely. I drove through the winding, meticulously manicured streets of their upscale neighborhood, parking my 10-year-old sedan as far away from their front door as possible. When I walked through the entryway, the house was stiflingly quiet. My mother pointed me straight toward the home office without making eye contact. "Your father is out running errands," she said briskly, smoothing down the front of her expensive blouse. "Just get the program running. We have dinner guests arriving at 7, and I do not want you lingering around the kitchen and getting in the way." I nodded, keeping my expression entirely neutral, and walked down the hall. I stepped into my father's study and closed the door behind me. The room was dim, smelling faintly of stale coffee, and the cheap cigars my father refused to give up. The heavy oak desk was a chaotic, disorganized mess of unopened mail, printed receipts, and yellow legal pads. I sat down in his creaky leather chair and wiggled the mouse to wake up the computer monitor. The software issue was incredibly trivial. It was just a corrupted update file causing the application to crash upon opening. As I waited for the system to reboot and reinstall the necessary components, my eyes naturally began to wander across the surface of the massive desk. As a professional bookkeeper, my brain is permanently wired to process financial information automatically. I cannot look at a spreadsheet without instinctively checking the formulas, and I cannot look at a stack of mail without noticing the return addresses and corporate logos. To an accountant, numbers do not lie. People lie. Expensive suits lie. Luxury cars and country club memberships lie. But a balance sheet is a brutal, unforgiving mirror that reflects the absolute truth. Buried beneath a heavy pile of home decor catalogs and hardware store flyers was a thick manila folder. It was slightly skewed, revealing the corner of a document inside. The logo printed on the top left corner of the visible page belonged to a notoriously aggressive subprime commercial lender. I knew this specific financial institution very well. In my line of work, I had seen small business owners turn to this exact lender only when traditional banks had completely shut them out. It was a lender of absolute last resort, famous for astronomical interest rates, hidden penalty fees, and ruthless collection tactics. I glanced toward the open doorway. I could hear the distant muffled sound of the television playing in the living room, where my mother was presumably folding laundry. I had a window of uninterrupted privacy. My heart began to beat a fraction faster as I reached out and carefully slid the folder out from under the heavy catalogs. The label on the tab simply read, "Brandon Business Accounts." I flipped open the cover. What I saw in the next 3 minutes completely dismantled the elaborate, glamorous illusion my brother had spent years forcing our family to believe. The first page was a corporate credit card statement. The balance was absolutely staggering. The card was completely maxed out to the absolute ceiling of a $50,000 limit. The minimum payment due was massive, but what immediately caught my trained eye was the penalty section. Brandon had been hit with late fees over limit fees, and returned payment fees for 6 consecutive months. The interest charges alone were burying him. He was not just struggling with a temporary cash flow problem. He was completely undeniably broke. I turned to the next page and my blood ran instantly cold. It was a formal, terrifying notice from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a federal tax lien for unpaid payroll taxes. As a financial professional, I knew exactly what this document meant. Brandon had been withholding income taxes and Social Security contributions from his employees' paychecks, but instead of remitting that money to the federal government, he had been illegally pocketing it to fund his lavish lifestyle. The federal government does not forgive payroll tax fraud. It is one of the most severe financial crimes a business owner can commit. The IRS was actively preparing to seize his business assets, freeze his corporate operating accounts, and potentially pursue criminal charges against him. According to the bold print at the bottom of the page, he owed over $80,000 in back taxes and accumulated penalties alone. My hands began to tremble as I uncovered the final document hidden at the back of the stack. It was a monthly statement from a major national retail bank for a home equity line of credit. The balance drawn on the account was exactly $250,000. I stared at the property address listed as collateral for the massive loan. My breath caught in my throat. It was the address of the sprawling suburban mansion where Brandon and Brittany lived. The beautiful house with the pristine landscaping. The house he constantly used as a weapon to mock my modest apartment and prove his financial superiority. I felt physically sick because I knew the legal history of that property intimately. 10 years ago, Grandpa William had purchased that house outright with cash as a long-term investment. He generously allowed Brandon and his new wife to live there rent-free, asking only that they cover the basic utilities and annual property taxes as a way to help his grandson build his supposedly successful business. The deed to that house was entirely unquestionably in Grandpa William's name. Brandon was legally nothing more than a glorified tenant. A bank does not grant a $250,000 home equity loan to a tenant. A financial institution requires the legal owner of the property to physically sign the mortgage documents, pledge the real estate as collateral, and authorize the lien. Grandpa William was a retired contractor who was fiercely protective of his hard-earned assets and deeply despised debt. He would never, under any circumstances, authorize a massive loan against his property to fund Brandon's failing business ventures. There was only one way Brandon could have secured that money. He had forged our grandfather's signature. He had fabricated the legal authorization, likely bringing in a compromised notary public or completely falsifying the identification process to steal $250,000 right out from under the man who had given him a roof over his head. Suddenly, the terrifying, unhinged encounter in the driveway made perfect, horrifying sense. Brandon had not cornered me because he wanted to pool our resources for a lucrative commercial investment. He was a desperate, drowning man grasping at straws. The fraudulent home equity loan required massive monthly payments that he could no longer afford to make. The subprime lenders were actively circling him. The Internal Revenue Service was preparing to seize whatever was left of his fake empire. If Brandon defaulted on the home equity loan, the bank would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings. They would send the default notices directly to the legal owner of the property on record. Grandpa William would open his mail and discover that his pristine investment house had been illegally mortgaged to the breaking point. Brandon would not just lose his fake luxury lifestyle, he would go to federal prison for mortgage fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Grandpa William's upcoming 80th birthday party was the ticking clock. Grandpa had formally promised us each a trust disbursement check for $145,000. Brandon desperately needed his own check plus my check to pay off the immediate tax liens and make a massive lump sum payment to the bank to keep the fraudulent home equity loan in good standing. My inheritance was the only thing standing between my brother and a prison cell. He was perfectly willing to bully me mentally, abuse me, and drain my entire financial future just to cover up his catastrophic crimes. My mind was crystal clear as a cold, relentless wave of determination washed over me. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the camera application and double-checked that the flash was completely disabled. Methodically, like a forensic auditor collecting evidence at a crime scene, I photographed every single document in that folder. I captured the account numbers on the maxed-out corporate credit cards. I photographed the federal tax lien notices ensuring the dates. The terrifying warnings and the exact amounts owed were perfectly legible in the frame. I took multiple highly detailed close-up shots of the home equity loan statement, clearly capturing the property address, the massive balance, and the forged borrower details. When I was absolutely certain I had captured every piece of ruinous, undeniable evidence, I carefully aligned the papers, closed the manila folder, and slid it exactly back into place beneath the heavy stack of home decor catalogs. I smoothed out the papers on the desk to erase any sign that I had been snooping. I turned my attention back to the computer screen. The tax software had finished rebooting and updating. It was running perfectly. I stood up, pushed the heavy leather chair back under the desk, and walked out of the quiet study. My mother was standing in the hallway inspecting a tiny smudge on the pristine painted wall. "The software is updated and fully functional," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and completely devoid of the massive secret I was now carrying. "You will not have any more issues filing the return." She did not thank me. She did not offer me a glass of water. She simply waved her hand dismissively toward the front door. "Good. You can let yourself out. Make sure the door locks behind you." I walked out of the house and got into my car. The engine hummed to life, providing a steady, reliable rhythm against the chaotic pounding of my heart. I pulled away from the curb and drove down the quiet, tree-lined street. I had arrived at this house as a dutiful, overlooked daughter, trying to fix a minor computer issue. I was leaving as the only person who possessed the exact combination of professional financial expertise and irrefutable documentary evidence required to dismantle my brother's entire life. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. My parents were far too blinded by their absolute favoritism to ever accept the truth. If I showed them these photographs, they would find a way to justify Brandon's criminal actions. They would blame me for invading his privacy, and they would double their efforts to force me to surrender my inheritance to save their golden child from the consequences of his own fraud. The only person who could stop this nightmare was the man whose legacy was currently being stolen. I bypassed the route to my own apartment and drove straight toward Grandpa William's house. The war was no longer just about an $85,000 car loan or a toxic family dynamic. It was about exposing a relentless predator who had hidden behind the protection of our family name for far too long. I parked my 10-year-old sedan in the narrow lot behind my apartment building. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I had the digital photographs of Brandon's financial ruin safely stored on my phone, but I knew I could not simply walk into Grandpa William's house and hand him a tiny glowing screen. I needed physical copies. I needed the brutal reality of those numbers printed in black and white ink laid out on a table where neither of us could deny what we were looking at. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my modest 1-bedroom unit. My apartment was quiet, safe, and entirely funded by my own relentless hard work as a bookkeeper. I unlocked the deadbolt, stepped inside, and immediately walked over to my small desk in the corner of the living room. I connected my phone to my inexpensive laser printer and began sending the images one by one. The machine whirred and clicked, spitting out page after page of undeniable evidence. I watched the paper pile up in the output tray. There was the maxed-out corporate credit card statement. There were the devastating federal tax lien notices from the Internal Revenue Service. And finally, the most damning document of all emerged. The home equity line of credit statement clearly showing a balance of $250,000 secured illegally against the suburban mansion that Grandpa William owned outright. I gathered the warm pages and aligned their edges, my mind racing with the implications of Brandon forging our grandfather's signature. I was just reaching for a thick manila envelope to secure the documents when a sudden aggressive pounding echoed through my small living room. The heavy knocking rattled the cheap wood of my front door. It was not a polite, casual tap. It was an entitled demand for immediate entry. I froze. I quickly shoved the printed bank statements into the envelope and pushed it under a stack of blank tax ledgers on my desk. I walked quietly to the door and peered through the peephole. My stomach plummeted. Standing in the dimly lit hallway were my father, my mother, and Brandon. They had followed me. They had left their own dinner guests, driven across town, and tracked me down at my sanctuary. I unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches, hoping to keep the conversation in the hallway. But my father, Richard, immediately pushed his heavy shoulder against the wood, forcing the door wide open and stepping into my personal space. My mother, Susan, followed right behind him, clutching her expensive handbag, as if my clean, organized apartment was a contaminated zone. Brandon walked in last, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his designer slacks. He looked agitated, his eyes darting around my living room, taking in my secondhand sofa and the small television I had bought on clearance. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stepping back to put some distance between us. "I told you I had nothing left to say." "We are your parents." "Jessica?" My father said, his voice thick with a patronizing authority. "We do not need an invitation to visit our daughter, especially when she is acting completely out of line and tearing this family apart over a simple favor." My mother immediately took over, launching into a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. She let her shoulders slump, her face contorting into a mask of profound, weary disappointment. She reached out and tried to touch my arm, but I deliberately stepped out of her reach. "Jessica, please," my mother began, her voice quivering with manufactured emotion. "You are being completely unreasonable. We are a family. We are supposed to be a united front. Your brother is under a tremendous amount of stress right now. He is trying to build a massive business empire, and he is just in a slight cash flow bind. It is temporary. He just needs a bridge to get through the next few months." I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her words echoing in the quiet room. A slight cash flow bind. That was what she was calling it. She was trying to minimize a situation that I now knew was a catastrophic financial collapse. My mother took a step closer, her tone shifting from pleading to aggressively guilt-inducing. "You do not have a husband or kids, Jessica. You sit here in this tiny apartment. What do you even need that $145,000 trust fund check for? You have no major expenses. Brandon has a wife. He has a status to maintain. He has a business that employs people. If you just sign your grandfather's check over to him after the birthday party, everything will be fine. He will pay you back with interest when his next big real estate deal closes." A cold, horrifying realization washed over me, chilling me right down to the marrow of my bones. I looked at my mother's pleading eyes. I looked at my father's stern, demanding posture. I looked at Brandon, who was standing quietly in the corner, letting our parents do his dirty work. They knew. They might not know the exact details of the forged home equity loan. They might not know about the federal tax liens threatening to put Brandon in federal prison. But they absolutely knew he was drowning in debt. They knew his real estate empire was a complete fabrication. They knew he was broke, and they had actively chosen to come to my apartment to bully me into handing over my entire inheritance to save him. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice my financial security, my future, and my hard-earned stability just to preserve the illusion of their successful golden boy. To them, my life was completely expendable. I was just a spare resource, a convenient bank account they could drain whenever Brandon made a mistake. The betrayal was so deep, so visceral, that for a moment I could not even draw a breath. I had spent my entire life trying to be the good, responsible daughter, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride they reserved for my brother. Standing in my living room, facing the 3 people who were supposed to be my family, I finally accepted that their love was never going to come. Brandon stepped out of the shadows, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. "Come on, Jessica," he coaxed, his voice dripping with fake brotherly affection. "It is just a temporary loan between family members. Do not make this a bigger deal than it is. Grandpa is handing out those checks next month. You sign yours over to my limited liability company and I will draft a formal promissory note. You will actually be making money off the interest. It is a win for everybody." I knew that if I challenged him right now, if I told them I had seen the fraudulent documents in my father's study, the situation would escalate into something dangerous. Brandon was backed into a corner by ruthless creditors and the federal government. A desperate man whose entire life was about to implode is capable of terrible things. If they knew I possessed photographic evidence of his mortgage fraud, they would not leave my apartment. They would demand my phone. They would tear my desk apart looking for the printed copies. I was alone, outnumbered, and dealing with a predator. I needed them out of my home immediately. I had to change my tactics. I forced my posture to relax. I let my shoulders drop, mimicking the defeated, submissive daughter they expected me to be. I looked down at the floor, intentionally breaking eye contact to signal surrender. "I am just so overwhelmed," I said, keeping my voice soft and slightly unsteady. "Everything is happening so fast. You showed up here unannounced, and I feel like I am being attacked. I do not want to fight with you anymore. I am just tired." My mother's face instantly brightened. The manufactured tears vanished, replaced by a triumphant gleam. She stepped forward and patted my shoulder, a hollow gesture devoid of any real warmth. "We are not attacking you, sweetie," she said smoothly. "We just want what is best for the whole family. We know you are a smart girl. You always make the right choices when you actually sit down and think about it." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the beige carpet. "I just need time," I whispered. "I need to think about it. Let me process everything you have said tonight. I promise I will give you an answer soon. Just please go home and let me get some sleep." My father let out a heavy sigh of relief, clearly satisfied that the rebellion had been crushed. "That is all we are asking, Jessica. Be logical. Do not let your emotions ruin your relationship with your brother. We will talk about the logistics of the check transfer as we get closer to your grandfather's birthday party." Brandon gave me a smug, victorious smile. "Thanks, Jess. I knew you would come to your senses. We make a good team when you actually listen." I kept my head bowed and said nothing as I walked them to the door. I stood in the entryway and watched as they filed out into the dimly lit hallway. My father gave me one last stern look before turning away. I gently pushed the door shut and immediately turned the deadbolt, sliding the security chain into place with a sharp metallic click. The second that door was locked, my defeated posture vanished. The fragile, overwhelmed daughter disappeared, replaced entirely by a seasoned financial professional preparing for war. I did not waste a single second. I rushed to my desk, lifted the stack of tax ledgers, and grabbed the thick manila envelope containing the printed evidence of Brandon's crimes. I threw on a dark jacket, grabbed my car keys, and slipped out the back door of my apartment building, avoiding the main hallway in case they were lingering in the parking lot. I got into my old sedan, locked the doors, and sped out of the alleyway into the cool night air. My destination was 20 minutes away, located in a quiet, established neighborhood where the houses were built with solid brick and surrounded by ancient oak trees. Grandpa William had built his home with his own two hands over 50 years ago. He was a man who believed in hard work, absolute honesty, and paying for things with cash. He despised debt, he despised liars, and he had a particular hatred for people who took advantage of family. When I pulled into his driveway, the house was dark except for a single warm light glowing in the kitchen window. Grandpa William was an early riser, but he often stayed up late reading historical biographies at the kitchen table. I walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. A moment later, the porch light flicked on, and the heavy wooden door swung open. Grandpa William stood there in his flannel robe, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp, intelligent eyes analyzing my unexpected arrival. "Jessica," he said, his voice deep and raspy. "It is almost midnight. What is going on?" I stepped into the foyer and looked at him, feeling the sheer weight of what I was about to reveal. "Grandpa, we need to talk. Right now. It is about Brandon, and it is about your investment property." He did not ask any questions. He simply nodded, closed the front door, and led me into the kitchen. The room was spotless, smelling of roasted coffee beans and pine cleaner. He motioned for me to sit at the large, polished oak table. I sat down, placed the manila envelope on the smooth wood, and carefully pulled out the printed photographs. I took a deep breath. "Grandpa, I was at my parents' house earlier this evening to fix their computer. I found a folder on Dad's desk. It belongs to Brandon. He is not a successful real estate investor. He is completely bankrupt. I slid the first document across the table. It was the corporate credit card statement showing the maxed out $50,000 balance and the exorbitant late fees. Grandpa William adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the numbers. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. I slid the next stack of papers toward him. These are federal tax lien notices from the Internal Revenue Service. He has not paid payroll taxes for his employees in 3 years. He owes the government over $80,000. They are preparing to seize his business. Grandpa William let out a low, disappointed sigh. A fool and his money, he muttered softly. He always wanted to look rich instead of actually working to be rich. That is not the worst part, Grandpa. I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the final document. The home equity line of credit statement. I placed it squarely in the center of the table. Grandpa William leaned forward, his eyes tracking across the bold print at the top of the page. He saw the massive balance of $250,000. Then his eyes dropped to the collateral address listed on the loan. It was his house, the house he held the deed to, the house Brandon was living in. I watched as my grandfather's expression transformed. The mild disappointment vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying fury. His hands, calloused from decades of construction work, pressed flat against the oak table. He did not yell. He did not curse. The silence in the kitchen became absolute and asphyxiating. He forged your signature, Grandpa, I explained gently, pointing to the borrower details. He committed mortgage fraud to take out $250,000 against your property to pay off his predatory lenders. And now the loan is coming due. He confronted me today and demanded I sign my upcoming trust fund check over to him so he can make a lump sum payment to the bank and keep this hidden from you. Grandpa William slowly removed his reading glasses and set them down next to the fraudulent bank statement. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a fierce protective intensity. He went after your inheritance to cover his theft, Grandpa stated, his voice dangerously calm. Yes, I replied, and Mom and Dad know he is in trouble. They showed up at my apartment tonight to guilt-trip me into giving him my money. They are willing to sacrifice my future to bail him out. Grandpa William closed his eyes for a long moment, absorbing the complete betrayal of his own son and grandson. When he opened his eyes again, the grandfatherly warmth was completely gone. He looked like the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from the ground up. Your brother thinks he is playing a clever game, Grandpa said quietly. He thinks he can steal my property, threaten my granddaughter, and use my own birthday party as a payday to cover his crimes. He reached across the table and gathered the printed documents into a neat, precise stack. We are not going to confront him today, Jessica. We are going to let him believe his plan is working. We are going to let your parents believe they have successfully manipulated you. I leaned forward, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and vindication. What are we going to do, Grandpa? He looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. My 80th birthday party is at the country club in 3 weeks. They are expecting a celebration. They are expecting me to hand out those checks. He tapped his index finger against the fraudulent bank statement. We are going to give them exactly what they want. A grand public spectacle. But before we do, I am making a call to my attorney. We have a lot of legal paperwork to draft, and we need to ensure the authorities are fully informed about this forged signature. When Brandon reaches for your check at that party, he's going to lose absolutely everything. 3 weeks later, the evening of Grandpa William's 80th birthday arrived, cloaked in an atmosphere of suffocating pretense. The Oak Ridge Country Club was exactly the kind of venue my parents and brother loved. It was a place designed to make people feel incredibly wealthy, even if their bank accounts were secretly bleeding dry. I parked my reliable 10-year-old sedan in the back of the sprawling parking lot, taking a long, deep breath before stepping out into the cool evening air. Tonight was the night the entire fabricated foundation of my family would be tested. Walking into the grand ballroom felt like stepping onto a movie set where everyone was playing a part. Over 50 guests filled the massive space, a mix of extended family members, old neighbors, and lifelong friends of my grandfather. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a dozen round dining tables draped in heavy white linen. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms circulated through the crowd, offering silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to a room full of absolute lies. My mother Susan glided across the carpet in a floor-length navy gown that likely cost more than my monthly rent. She was completely in her element, holding court near a massive ice sculpture carved into the shape of the number 80. I stood silently near a towering floral arrangement, sipping a glass of sparkling water, just watching her performance unfold. She was loudly boasting to a group of my father's old business associates, gesturing wildly with her champagne glass. She spoke about Brandon as if he were a Wall Street titan. She bragged about his vast portfolio of commercial real estate, his brilliant investment strategies, and how proud she was to be the mother of such a visionary entrepreneur. A few feet away, Brandon's wife Brittany was putting on her own spectacular show. She wore a shimmering designer cocktail dress and intentionally held her wine glass high so the ballroom lights would catch the massive diamond on her finger. She was surrounded by a group of her country club friends, complaining loudly about the delayed delivery of her brand-new $85,000 luxury SUV. She sighed dramatically, telling everyone how exhausting it was to manage so much wealth. She acted completely unaware that her husband was secretly $250,000 in debt to a predatory subprime lender. She had no idea that the federal government was actively preparing to seize whatever was left of their fraudulent life. My father Richard stood by the premium open bar, clapping Brandon heavily on the shoulder. My brother wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, holding a tumbler of expensive whiskey. My father was introducing him to a retired bank manager, literally puffing out his chest with paternal pride. As a professional bookkeeper, I have learned that a balance sheet is a brutal, unforgiving mirror. Numbers never care about your ego or your custom-tailored suits. Watching my family parade around the ballroom like high society royalty made my stomach churn with a sickening mixture of disgust and sorrow. I knew the absolute truth. I had the photographic evidence of Brandon's maxed-out corporate credit cards locked safely in my apartment. I had the images of the federal tax liens for unpaid payroll taxes. I had the undeniable proof that my brother had committed felony mortgage fraud by forging Grandpa William's signature to take out a massive home equity line of credit against a house he did not even own. They were celebrating an empire built on quicksand, and the tide was rapidly coming in. I scanned the room and finally spotted the man of the hour. Grandpa William sat at the head table wearing a classic, impeccably tailored black suit. To the rest of the room, he looked like a proud patriarch celebrating a wonderful milestone surrounded by his loving family. But when his sharp, intelligent eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom, I saw the fierce, unyielding resolve of a man prepared to demolish a liar. We exchanged a single subtle nod. He was playing his part flawlessly, greeting everyone warmly, accepting their handshakes and birthday wishes, completely hiding the legal nuclear bomb waiting inside his breast pocket. The evening progressed through a lavish 3-course dinner. I sat at a table near the back, picking at my roasted salmon, quietly enduring the small talk of distant cousins who continually asked me why I was not as successful as my older brother. I gave them polite practice smiles and offered vague answers about enjoying my simple bookkeeping career. Every time I glanced toward the front of the room, I caught Brandon staring at me. His smiles were sharp and predatory. He truly believed he had me completely trapped. He believed the visit to my apartment 3 weeks ago had broken my spirit. He was absolutely certain that by the end of this night, I would quietly surrender my entire inheritance to save him from financial ruin. After the dinner plates were cleared away and the waitstaff began pouring fresh coffee, the atmosphere in the room shifted toward anticipation. Everyone knew why they were really here. The generous trust fund disbursement had been the worst-kept secret in our family for months. Grandpa William stood up slowly, picking up a silver spoon and gently tapping it against his crystal water glass. The clear, ringing sound immediately silenced the low hum of conversation. 50 guests turned their attention to the head table. Grandpa smiled. looking out over the crowd of people he had known for decades. He spoke into the microphone, thanking everyone for gathering to celebrate his 80th year of life. He spoke about hard work, about building a legacy, and about the importance of family honesty. I watched my mother dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the deeply moved daughter-in-law. I watched Brandon nod solemnly, pretending to understand the value of honest labor. The sheer hypocrisy was suffocating. Then Grandpa William lowered his voice, taking on a tone of intimate family business. He announced that before the cake was cut and the champagne toasts continued, he wanted to share a brief private moment with his 2 grandchildren. He formally requested that Brandon and I join him in the private lounge just off the main hallway to receive our birthday gifts. A ripple of excited murmurs swept through the ballroom. My parents beamed with greedy anticipation. Brittany practically shoved Brandon toward the front of the room. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the heavy double doors leading out of the banquet hall. Brandon met me in the corridor, matching my pace. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive jacket as we walked side by side. He looked incredibly smug, practically vibrating with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone in the building. We entered a small, dimly lit lounge completely paneled in rich mahogany. A heavy oak desk sat in the center of the room, flanked by 2 leather armchairs. One wall featured a row of large glass panels that looked out into the main hallway, allowing anyone passing by to see inside, but thick enough to block all sound. Grandpa William closed the door behind us, instantly muting the loud chatter and classical music of the party. The silence in the small room was heavy and charged. He walked around to the other side of the oak desk and turned to face us. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and slowly withdrew 2 crisp, white envelopes. He looked at my brother. Brandon was practically salivating, his eyes fixed on the paper in my grandfather's hands. The mask of the successful businessman had slipped, completely revealing the desperate, greedy reality beneath. Grandpa William held out the first envelope. Brandon took it immediately, tearing the seal open with a speed that lacked any grace or respect. He pulled out the heavy watermarked paper. Even from a few feet away, I could see the reflection of the warm lounge lights catching the glossy surface of a certified cashier's check for exactly $145,000. Brandon let out a massive, trembling breath. It was the sound of a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water. He stared at the amount, his thumbs aggressively rubbing the edges of the paper. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the glass panels of the lounge door. I followed his gaze. Our parents, Richard and Susan, were standing right outside in the hallway, pressing close to the glass, watching the exchange with hungry, eager eyes. Brandon flashed them a brilliant, arrogant smile. He held the check up against his chest and gave them a subtle, victorious thumbs up. My mother actually clapped her hands together in silent delight, her face glowing with the absolute certainty that their financial worries were over. Grandpa William then turned to me. He extended his hand, offering me the second white envelope. I took it gently, my fingers brushing against his. I looked into his eyes, communicating a silent promise that I was ready for whatever came next. I opened the envelope and slid out my own cashier's check printed with my name and the identical sum of $145,000. "Happy birthday to me," Grandpa William said, his voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight. "And a secure future to you both. Make sure you spend it exactly how you deserve." "Thank you, Grandpa," Brandon said quickly, his voice entirely devoid of genuine gratitude. "You have no idea what this means for my business. This capital is going to generate massive returns." Grandpa William gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I am absolutely certain it will produce exactly what you have earned, Brandon. Now, if you both will excuse me, I need to use the restroom before I return to my guests. Do not wait for me. Go back and enjoy the party." He walked past us, opening the heavy lounge door and stepping out into the corridor. My parents immediately swarmed him, showering him with fake affection and loud thanks, escorting him down the hall toward the main lobby. For a brief suspended moment, Brandon and I were entirely alone in the quiet lounge. I slipped my check back into its envelope and turned to leave. I reached for the brass handle of the door, fully expecting Brandon to follow me back to the crowded, safe environment of the ballroom. But the moment the heavy door clicked shut behind us, cutting us off from the sightlines of the main party, the entire atmosphere violently shifted. The polished golden boy facade instantly evaporated, replaced by something dark, frantic, and deeply aggressive. We were standing in a narrow, poorly lit section of the corridor, tucked away in a recessed alcove near the coat check room, completely out of sight from the main banquet hall. Before I could take a single step forward, Brandon lunged. He reached out with a terrifying speed and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my dress, his grip tight and unyielding. He shoved me roughly backward, forcing me deep into the shadows of the alcove, pinning me between the wall and his large frame. The air was completely knocked out of my lungs. I looked up at him, genuinely shocked by the sudden brazen physical aggression. His eyes were wide and manic, completely stripped of their usual smug superiority. He was no longer a wealthy businessman asking for a family favor. He was a cornered, desperate predator who had finally run out of time and options. With his free hand, he reached aggressively into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper and a heavy black luxury pen. He shoved the paper directly against my chest, pressing me harder against the wall. I looked down at the document. It was not a simple informal loan agreement. It was a highly detailed, legally binding transfer of funds contract. He had paid an attorney to pre-draft a document specifically designed to irrevocably assign the full exact amount of my $145,000 trust disbursement directly into the primary operating account of his commercial holding company. The document included language waiving my right to demand repayment on any specific timeline, effectively turning my entire inheritance into a permanent unsecured gift to his failing business. "Sign it," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous, threatening whisper. I stared at him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I did not move. I did not reach for the pen. I said, "Sign it right now, Jessica," he demanded, leaning his face so close to mine, I could smell the sharp tang of the whiskey on his breath. "I need your check fully endorsed and this legal document executed before we walk back into that ballroom. You promised Mom and Dad you would help the family. You are not walking out of this hallway with that money." I looked at the absolute terror vibrating just beneath his suffocating rage. He needed my check immediately. His own $145,000 was not nearly enough to cover the massive hole he had dug for himself. He needed his money to pay off the federal tax liens and stop the Internal Revenue Service from arresting him. He needed my money to make a massive lump sum payment to the subprime lender to stop them from foreclosing on Grandpa William's house and exposing his felony mortgage fraud. He needed to consume my entire future just to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be rich. He was completely willing to physically intimidate me, manipulate me, and drain every single dollar to my name to protect his fragile, pathetic ego. The fear that had initially gripped my chest suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I was no longer the quiet, invisible sister he could push around. I was the person holding the match, standing over the gasoline he had poured all over his own life. I looked at the expensive black pen trembling in his hand. I looked at the legal document crushed against my dress. And then I looked directly into his frantic, desperate eyes. I stared at the expensive black pen trembling in his hand. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to yield to that exact look of entitled fury. My parents had spent decades teaching me that keeping the peace meant sacrificing my own security to make my brother comfortable. But right now, backed into the dim alcove of the Oak Ridge Country Club, that lifelong conditioning completely shattered. I did not see a powerful real estate investor standing before me. I saw a terrified, bankrupt thief trying to pick my pocket. I planted my feet firmly on the thick carpet. I raised both of my hands and shoved my brother squarely in the center of his chest. I put every single ounce of strength I had into that push. Brandon stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished floorboard near the coat check door. The sheer shock on his flushed face was almost comical. He had never expected his quiet, reliable sister to fight back. Before he could regain his balance and block my path, I stepped around him and marched straight down the narrow corridor. My heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, but my strides were long and deliberate. I needed to reach the safety of the main banquet hall. I needed witnesses. Behind me, I heard the heavy, frantic scuffle of his footsteps. "Jessica, get back here right now," he hissed. His voice was a desperate, malicious whisper echoing off the dark mahogany walls. "You are making a massive mistake. You do not walk away from me." I ignored him. I gripped the thick white envelope containing my $145,000 check tightly in my right hand. The muffled sounds of the string quartet playing a classical piece grew louder and clearer with every step I took. The warm golden light of the ballroom spilled out through the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway. I did not hesitate. I pushed through those doors and stepped directly into the vibrant, crowded space. The contrast between the dark, violent hallway and the bright, elegant party was incredibly disorienting. Over 50 guests were standing around the room laughing, sipping champagne, and celebrating Grandpa William's 80th birthday. Near the massive ice sculpture, my mother Susan was still holding court. She was beaming with immense pride as she talked to a group of elderly neighbors, undoubtedly boasting about her successful son. Across the room, Brittany was waving her diamond ring around, complaining to her friends about her delayed luxury vehicle. At the head table, Grandpa William sat perfectly still. He was watching the doors. When he saw me enter with my shoulders tense and my breathing shallow, his sharp eyes locked onto mine. He registered the escalating situation immediately. I began to walk quickly toward his table, navigating through the maze of white linen-covered rounds and chatting guests. I just needed to reach my grandfather. I needed to stand next to the only person in this room who knew the absolute truth about the man stalking me. I made it exactly halfway across the ballroom before Brandon caught up. The heavy pretense of his wealthy, sophisticated persona completely disintegrated. He did not care about the country club decorum anymore. He reached out and clamped his large hand down on my left shoulder, his fingers digging into my skin like absolute claws. He jerked me backward with such sudden aggressive force that I nearly lost my footing. I spun around to face him. His face was flushed crimson, a prominent vein throbbing dangerously at his temple. In one swift, violent motion, he lunged forward and literally snatched the white envelope right out of my hand. The sudden physical altercation drew the immediate attention of the guests closest to us. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A woman in a green silk dress gasped loudly and took a cautious step back. The silence began to ripple outward like a heavy stone dropped into a quiet pond. Brandon did not care who was watching. He leaned in, waving the crumpled envelope directly in my face, his breath hot and ragged. "Hand it over," he hissed maliciously, his voice dripping with venom and desperation. "Family comes first. You are just a selfish little spinster." Those words were meant to shrink me. They were the exact same words my parents had used to control me my entire life. They were designed to make me feel small, invisible, and obligated to serve his needs. But standing under the bright crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the wealthy people my family wanted so desperately to impress, I realized I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My fear evaporated instantly, replaced by a searing, white-hot, righteous anger. I stepped directly into his personal space, refusing to cower. I reached out, grabbed his wrist with my left hand, and violently snatched the envelope right back out of his grip with my right. The thick paper tore slightly at the corner, but I held firmly onto my inheritance. I looked him dead in the eye, took a deep breath, and yelled, projecting my voice loudly enough for the entire banquet hall to hear every single syllable. "I am not paying off your gambling and fraud debts." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, the cellist's bow freezing completely midair. The soft clinking of silverware and crystal glasses vanished. Brittany lowered her expensive wine glass, her jaw dropping open in utter uncomprehending confusion. My father, Richard, stood frozen at the premium bar, his drink suspended halfway to his mouth. My mother stopped talking mid-sentence, the arrogant smile melting off her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. I stood my ground, clutching the torn envelope securely against my chest. I watched the horrible realization dawn on Brandon's face. The secret he had been desperately trying to hide, the massive web of financial lies, the illegal loans, the unpaid federal taxes, was suddenly exposed to the very people he wanted to impress. His pristine reputation was completely shattered in a matter of 5 seconds. He looked around the room, seeing the shock, the harsh judgment, and the whispered questions forming on the lips of his supposed peers. The exposure snapped whatever thin thread of sanity he had left. His eyes went completely dark with a blind, uncontrollable rage. He did not think about the consequences. He did not think about the 50 witnesses. He simply reacted like a cornered predator. Brandon pulled his right arm back and swung. The heavy open palm slap cracked across the left side of my face with the terrifying force of a whip. The sudden impact snapped my head violently to the side. A blinding flash of white light exploded in my vision, and a sharp, high-pitched ringing immediately filled my left ear. I stumbled backward, my hip crashing hard into the edge of a dining table, rattling the crystal water glasses and silverware. I tasted the sudden warm metallic tang of copper as my teeth cut deep into the inside of my bottom lip. The ballroom descended into a horrifying, absolute dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 50 people stood completely frozen in place, staring in absolute horror at the wealthy, successful real estate investor who had just physically assaulted his own sister in the middle of a formal dinner. I leaned heavily against the table, trying to steady my breathing. I slowly lifted my trembling hand to touch my stinging cheek. My fingers came away with a small smear of bright red blood from the corner of my mouth. I did not cry. I did not fall to the floor. I simply stood back up, planted my feet firmly on the carpet, and stared right back at him. Brandon looked down at his own shaking hand, his chest heaving aggressively. The reality of what he had just done in front of a massive audience was finally crashing down on him. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Then the crowd parted. Quick, panicked footsteps approached rapidly from the right side of the room. It was my mother. Susan rushed forward, pushing aggressively past a group of stunned guests, her heavy navy gown swishing frantically around her ankles. For one brief, foolish fraction of a second, the wounded 13-year-old girl inside me thought my mother was coming to protect me. I thought that seeing her own son physically strike her daughter would finally break the toxic spell of favoritism. I thought she would run to my side, ask if I was okay, and demand to know why he had hit me. I thought the sight of my bleeding lip would finally make her act like a real mother. But Susan did not even look at my bleeding lip. She did not look at my rapidly bruising cheek. She marched straight up to me. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury, completely ignoring the man who had just assaulted me. "Jessica, how dare you humiliate your brother in public?" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure indignation. The ultimate betrayal washed over me, a feeling much colder and far more painful than the physical slap. My mother reached out and grabbed Brandon's arm, pulling him slightly behind her, as if he were the fragile victim who desperately needed shielding from a monster. "You vicious, spiteful girl," she continued, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You wait until your grandfather's birthday party to make up disgusting lies about your brother's finances just to ruin his reputation. You could not stand seeing him succeed. You are an absolute disgrace to this family. What is wrong with you?" I listened to her scream. I listened to my father rushing over to join them, wrapping his arm around Brandon's shoulder to support him. I looked at the three of them standing tightly together as a united front against me. They were desperately trying to rewrite reality, trying to convince the staring room that I was crazy just to protect their golden boy. They did not care that he had lied. They did not care that he had stolen. They certainly did not care that he had just hit me. The throbbing pain in my jaw was absolutely nothing compared to the crystal-clear realization settling into my mind. They were a completely lost cause. They would defend his crimes until the bitter, devastating end. But I did not need to defend myself anymore. I did not need to argue with my screaming mother or explain the intricate details of the mortgage fraud to the silent, staring guests. I slowly wiped the blood from my chin, holding the torn white envelope securely in my hand. I looked past my furious mother, past my shaking, cowardly brother, and fixed my gaze on the head table. Grandpa William was standing up. He was no longer smiling. His face was set in lines of cold, absolute fury. And he was holding a very thick manila folder. The sharp, dry crack of solid wood striking the polished hardwood floor sliced through the chaotic noise of the banquet hall like a gunshot. My mother was still screaming at me, her face flushed with indignant rage. Her finger pointed squarely at my bleeding lip. My father was still hovering over Brandon, acting as a human shield for the man who had just assaulted me. But that single echoing thud from the front of the room instantly paralyzed them all. I turned my head, my cheek burning furiously from the impact of my brother's hand. Grandpa William stood at the head table. He held his heavy wooden cane in his right hand, having just brought it down with tremendous, deliberate force. He was not shouting. He did not look panicked, nor did he look like a frail 80-year-old man overwhelmed by family drama. He stood incredibly tall, his shoulders squared, his jaw set in a line of immovable granite. The warm, golden light from the crystal chandeliers seemed to cast a harsh, unforgiving shadow across his face. He struck the floor one more time. The sound commanded absolute submission from the 50 guests gathered in the room. The lingering whispers died instantly. The wealthy country club attendees, my parents' pretentious friends, and the distant relatives all froze in place. "Susan, step away from my granddaughter," Grandpa William commanded. His voice was dangerously calm. It was a low, resonant rumble that completely filled the silent ballroom, carrying the undeniable authority of a man who had spent a lifetime running construction crews and commanding respect. My mother blinked, clearly disoriented by his tone. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy her usual tactics of manipulation and victimhood. "William, you do not understand what is happening here," she started, gesturing wildly toward Brandon. "Jessica is making up horrible lies and trying to ruin your birthday celebration. She is out of control." "I said step away from her, Susan, Grandpa." William repeated, his voice dropping an octave lower, leaving absolutely no room for debate. My mother snapped her mouth shut. The sheer force of his glare physically pushed her backward. She took 3 cautious steps away from me, her expensive navy gown rustling against the carpet. My father placed a hesitant hand on Brandon's back, but neither of them dared to speak. Grandpa William slowly walked away from the head table and moved toward the microphone stand positioned at the center of the dance floor. Every single eye in the room followed his movements. The silence was so profound, so suffocating, that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the large grandfather clock in the country club lobby down the hall. He reached the microphone, adjusted the stand with agonizing precision, and looked directly at my brother. Brandon was trying desperately to maintain his posture. He puffed out his chest, attempting to wear the mask of the confident, successful real estate investor, but a visible sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the edge of a dining table. "I apologize to my guests for the sudden interruption of our evening," Grandpa William spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing cleanly off the high ceilings. "I invited you all here tonight to celebrate my 80th year of life. I intended to use this occasion to disperse a portion of my estate to my grandchildren, to give them a solid foundation for their futures. I believed I was rewarding hard work, honesty, and family loyalty." He paused, sliding his hand into the inner pocket of his tailored black suit jacket. "However, it has recently been brought to my attention that my generosity is being exploited to cover up a sprawling, pathetic web of financial crimes." A collective muffled gasp rippled through the crowd of guests. Brittany, Brandon's wife, suddenly dropped her hand, the massive diamond ring she had been showing off all evening catching the fabric of her designer dress. She stared at my grandfather, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide her rising panic. Grandpa William pulled a thick, heavy manila folder from his jacket. It was the exact same folder I had helped him organize in the dead of night at his kitchen table. He placed it carefully onto the wooden podium. Brandon, Grandpa said, fixing his gaze on his grandson like a hawk, locking onto its prey. The cashier's check you're currently holding in your hand. The check for $145,000 that I handed to you just 10 minutes ago. It is completely void. Brandon flinched as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy sound emerged. I placed a stop payment order on that specific check with my bank manager at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Grandpa William continued, his voice completely stripped of any familial warmth. It is nothing but a worthless printed piece of paper. You will not be depositing it into your commercial holding account. You will not be using it to pay off your secret debts. And you certainly will not be intimidating your sister into surrendering her portion to save your sinking ship. The color drained entirely from Brandon's face. The smug, arrogant, golden boy was evaporating right before our eyes, replaced by a terrified fraud who had finally been caught in the glaring light. "Grandpa, this is crazy!" Brandon stammered, his voice pitching upward in desperation. He looked frantically around the room, trying to laugh it off for the audience. "I do not know what Jessica has been telling you, but she is lying. I run a highly successful property management firm. I have massive assets. I do not need your money to pay off debts. I was going to invest it for you." Grandpa William did not engage with the lie. He simply opened the manila folder. He looked down at the neatly organized stack of papers, his expression utterly clinical, like a forensic auditor preparing to dismantle a ruined company. "Let us talk about your massive assets," Brandon Grandpa said calmly. He lifted the first sheet of paper and held it up for the room to see. "This is a formal notice of a federal tax lien. It was issued by the Internal Revenue Service. According to this document, you have failed to remit payroll taxes for your employees for over 3 years. You owe the federal government $83,000 in back taxes and accumulated penalties. The IRS is actively preparing to seize your business accounts." Whispers immediately broke out among the 50 guests. My father's former business associates leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. Brittany took 2 steps away from Brandon, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "That is fake," Brandon shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the podium. "Jessica fabricated that. She is a bookkeeper. She knows how to forge documents." Grandpa William ignored the desperate accusation. He turned the page in his folder. He pulled out the corporate credit card statements. "You have 5 corporate credit cards," Brandon Grandpa read aloud, projecting his voice over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Every single one of them is maxed out to the absolute limit. You are carrying over $100,000 in high-interest, unsecured debt. You are currently facing default notices from 3 separate private lenders. You do not own a real estate empire. You run a glorified Ponzi scheme, and you have run out of people to rob." My father Richard finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He stepped forward, his face dark red with embarrassment and anger. He still could not comprehend that his perfect son was a criminal. He still believed this was some kind of elaborate mistake orchestrated by me. "Dad, stop this right now," Richard demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the ballroom. "You are airing family business in front of strangers. Brandon is a good man. He just had a few bad quarters. Every businessman goes through a rough patch. You are publicly humiliating him over a temporary cash flow problem." "A temporary cash flow problem," Grandpa William repeated softly. The quiet intensity of his tone made my father freeze in his tracks. He looked at his son with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute disgust. "Richard, your ignorance is astounding. But your willful blindness ends tonight." Grandpa reached into the back of the manila folder. He pulled out the final document, the home equity line of credit statement, the undeniable proof of felony mortgage fraud. He held the paper up, his hand perfectly steady. 10 years ago, Grandpa began, his voice ringing with absolute clarity, "I purchased the house that Brandon and Brittany currently live in. I bought it in cash. The deed is entirely in my name. I allowed them to live there rent-free to help them build a life. But 2 months ago, Brandon took out a home equity loan against my property. He borrowed $250,000 from a predatory subprime lender." The silence in the ballroom became heavy, thick, and utterly suffocating. Nobody dared to breathe. Even my mother had stopped defending him, her eyes glued to the piece of paper in my grandfather's hand. Because the deed is in my name. Grandpa continued pacing his words for maximum impact. Brandon could not legally secure that loan. The bank required the legal owner to sign the authorization. So my grandson fabricated the identification. He brought in a compromised notary, and he deliberately forged my legal signature on a $250,000 mortgage document. A sharp hysterical sob tore through the quiet room. It was Brittany. She collapsed into an empty dining chair, burying her face in her hands, her luxury lifestyle suddenly revealed as a criminal illusion. Brandon was shaking violently now. He took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors at the back of the banquet hall. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. My mother could not accept it. Susan shook her head aggressively, her denial a powerful, blinding force. "No!" she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly. "No, that is not true. Brandon would never do that. William, you are confused. Your mind is going. Jessica put these fake papers on your desk to frame him because she is jealous of his success. Brandon, tell him it is a lie." She turned to her golden boy, expecting him to confidently deny the charges, expecting him to smooth everything over with his usual arrogant charm. But Brandon could not look her in the eye. He stared at his expensive shoes, his breathing shallow and rapid, unable to formulate a single word of defense. Grandpa William looked down at my mother. The expression on his face was one of profound, terrifying pity. It was the look you give a person right before you deliver a fatal diagnosis. "Susan," Grandpa said quietly, "I truly wish the forgery was the worst of it. I wish this ended with my property." I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. I stood near the edge of the tables, watching my grandfather closely. This was not part of the plan we had discussed in his kitchen. I had only shown him the corporate debt, the tax liens, and the forged home equity loan. I had no idea what he was talking about. Grandpa William closed the manila folder and rested his hands heavily on the podium. He took a long, steadying breath. After Jessica came to me with the initial evidence of the mortgage fraud, I hired an independent forensic accountant. I needed to know exactly how deep this rot went. I needed to know who else Brandon had targeted to keep his fraudulent lifestyle afloat. He turned his gaze slowly toward my father. "Richard," Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a low, devastating rumble. 2 years ago, you gave Brandon full power of attorney over your retirement accounts. You told everyone he was going to manage your wealth aggressively, invest your savings, and secure your financial future so you could retire early. Do you remember doing that?" My father swallowed hard, his face suddenly turning a sickly shade of gray. "Yes," he whispered, the confident bluster completely draining from his voice. "He is a professional. He knows the markets." Grandpa William shook his head slowly, a gesture of absolute finality. "He is not a professional, Richard. He is a desperate thief who was drowning in high-interest debt. And when the predatory lenders started threatening to seize his assets, he did not come to you for help. He used the power of attorney you willingly handed him." The ballroom felt like it was suspended in a vacuum. I watched my mother's hands slowly fall to her sides. "He gained full access to your primary investment portfolios," Grandpa said, delivering the words with surgical precision. "And over the past 14 months, he systematically liquidated every single asset. He sold your mutual funds. He cashed out your bonds. He transferred the capital into offshore holding accounts to mask the trail, and then funneled it directly to his creditors to cover his massive outstanding debts." "No," my father choked out, staggering backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He bumped heavily against a linen-covered table, sending a silver fork crashing to the floor. "No, that is impossible. We have nearly $900,000 in those accounts. We just reviewed the quarterly statements last month." "They were fabricated," Richard, Grandpa stated, cutting down the last pillar of my father's denial. "The statements he handed you were completely forged, designed to keep you pacified while he drained you dry. The forensic accountant pulled the actual bank records directly from your financial institution yesterday morning." Grandpa William leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that the brutal, absolute truth reached every single corner of the silent country club ballroom. He drained it all. Richard, your golden boy, the son you sacrificed your daughter to protect, drained every single penny you and Susan have saved for the last 30 years. He stole your entire future just to pay the interest on his luxury cars and his fake real estate empire. There is exactly $412 left in your primary retirement account. You are completely, utterly bankrupt. The physical transformation of my parents was something I will never, ever forget. My mother, the woman who had spent my entire life judging my modest apartment and lecturing me about financial responsibility, let out a sound that did not even seem human. It was a hollow, breathless wheeze of absolute despair. Her knees buckled beneath her. She grabbed the edge of a high-top cocktail table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute that shattered into dozens of pieces on the hardwood floor. She sank to her knees, her expensive navy gown pooling around her in the spilled wine, her eyes wide, staring at the floor with unblinking, horrified emptiness. My father looked like he had suffered a massive stroke. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Brandon. For 20 seconds, nobody moved. My father stared at his favorite child, the son he had endlessly praised, the man he had demanded I give my trust fund to. He waited for Brandon to deny it. He waited for Brandon to scream that Grandpa William was lying. But Brandon just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet his father's gaze. The arrogant, wealthy investor was gone. All that remained was a pathetic, broken thief who had finally run out of places to hide. Brandon, my father whispered, his voice cracking with a devastation so deep it made the hair on my arms stand up. Tell me it is a lie. Tell me you did not steal our money. Brandon slowly shook his head, a single pathetic gesture of surrender. I had to, Dad. He mumbled, his voice trembling. The lenders were going to hurt me. I was going to put it back. I swear I was going to win it back on the next deal. The perfect family facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the country club floor. The golden child they had worshipped, the son they had thrown me under the bus to protect, had eaten them alive. Their entitlement, their arrogance, their cruel judgments against me, it had all dissolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. They had protected a parasite, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. I stood quietly near the floral arrangement, holding my torn white envelope, watching the people who had abused me for 30 years realize their lives were entirely over. But Grandpa William was not finished. He had exposed the rot, but he had not yet delivered the punishment. He reached into his jacket one last time, withdrawing a crisp, legally bound stack of papers that would ensure Brandon never saw a dime of our family's money ever again. The heavy silence in the ballroom was absolute. The air felt thick-heavy with the suffocating weight of a truth that had just completely destroyed my parents' entire world. My father stood near a linen-covered table, looking like a man who had just been hollowed out from the inside. My mother was still on her knees on the polished hardwood floor, the expensive fabric of her designer gown soaking up spilled champagne, her eyes staring blankly at the spaces between the floorboards. She had just learned that her beloved golden child, the son she had praised and protected at my expense for my entire life, had systematically stolen every single penny of her retirement savings. But Grandpa William was not finished. He stood tall behind the microphone stand, his shoulders broad and square. He did not look like an 80-year-old man celebrating a birthday. He looked like a judge presiding over a courtroom, preparing to hand down a final irrevocable sentence. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored black suit jacket one last time. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a crisp, heavily stapled stack of legal documents. The papers were printed on thick parchment bearing the distinct blue seal of a prestigious law firm. Brandon, Grandpa William said. His voice was no longer loud, but it carried a sharp, piercing quality that cut through the cavernous space of the country club ballroom. Look at me when I am speaking to you. My brother slowly lifted his head. His face was a ghastly shade of gray. The arrogant swagger, the custom-tailored suit, the expensive haircut, none of it mattered anymore. He looked incredibly small, shrinking under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers and the intense scrutiny of 50 staring guests. He looked exactly like the terrified, desperate thief he truly was. For 30 years, Grandpa William began his words, dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. I have tried to teach this family the value of hard work. I built my business with my own 2 hands. I taught you that wealth is not about what you show to the world. It is about integrity. It is about honesty. It is about building a foundation that can withstand a storm. I thought I was passing those values down to my grandson. I was entirely wrong. Grandpa held up the thick stack of legal documents. Yesterday afternoon, my attorney finalized a complete and total revision of my estate planning, Grandpa announced, projecting his voice so that every single person in the room could hear the absolute finality of his decision. Brandon, effective immediately. You are completely and permanently disinherited. You have been struck from my will. You have been removed from my trusts, and you will never receive another single dollar from my estate. You have proven that you cannot be trusted with money, and you certainly cannot be trusted with family. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut. A small, pathetic whimper escaped his throat. He had gambled everything on outsmarting an 80-year-old man, and he had lost spectacularly. Grandpa William turned his sharp gaze toward the right side of the room. Brittany was standing near the ice sculpture, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her hands trembling as she clutched her expensive designer purse. She had spent the entire evening parading around the party, boasting to anyone who would listen about her wealthy husband and her lavish lifestyle. Brittany, Grandpa William said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. I suggest you listen very closely because your husband has clearly been lying to you just as much as he has been lying to the rest of the world. Brittany flinched, taking a cautious step backward as the eyes of the entire room shifted to her. You have spent the last 3 hours bragging to my friends about your brand new $85,000 luxury vehicle, Grandpa stated. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his podium. I had my forensic accountant look into that purchase this morning. That vehicle is not registered to your husband. It is not registered to his failing limited liability company. Because Brandon's credit is completely destroyed, he used the corporate account routing numbers associated with my property management firm to secure the financing. That vehicle legally belongs to me. Brittany let out a sharp, high-pitched shriek. No, she cried out, her voice echoing wildly across the dining tables. No, that is my car. Brandon bought that for me for our anniversary. He promised me. He bought it with stolen leverage, Brittany Grandpa corrected her, his voice unyielding. And because it is legally registered under my corporate umbrella, I have already contacted the dealership and the local authorities to report it as an unauthorized purchase. The vehicle will be repossessed from your driveway tomorrow morning. Brittany burst into loud, hysterical tears. She turned to Brandon, slamming her hands against his chest, screaming at him to fix it, demanding to know how he could do this to her. Brandon just stood there, completely unresponsive, his arms hanging limply at his sides as his wife continued to hit his chest. He had absolutely nothing left to say. The entire illusion of his massive real estate empire had been burned to the ground in less than 10 minutes. But the brutal dismantling was still not over. Grandpa William picked up another document from his stack. It was a formal, heavily formalized piece of legal paper. He stepped out from behind the microphone stand and walked slowly across the dance floor. The guests parted for him, automatically stepping back to clear a path. He walked directly up to Brandon. My brother could not even bring himself to look our grandfather in the eye. He kept his head bowed, staring at the polished hardwood floor. Grandpa stopped 2 feet away from him. He held out the document. Take it, Grandpa commanded. Brandon raised a trembling hand and took the paper. He did not look at it. He already knew what it was. That is a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. Grandpa William declared, his voice echoing loudly in the close proximity. I am the sole legal owner of the house you currently occupy. You have violated every single term of our verbal agreement. You have brought predatory lenders to my doorstep. You have 30 days to pack your belongings and vacate my property. If you or your wife are still inside that house on the 31st day, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." My mother let out another harrowing wail from the floor. "William, please," she sobbed, crawling forward on her knees, the spilled champagne staining the front of her expensive dress. "You cannot make them homeless. They are your family. He is your grandson. Please have some mercy." Grandpa William looked down at my mother. The profound disappointment in his eyes was almost too heavy to witness. "Susan," he said softly, "he stole your entire retirement. He left you with $400 to your name. He struck your daughter across the face not 10 minutes ago right here in this room, and you are still begging me to protect him. Your blind devotion to this boy is a sickness, and it has finally destroyed you. I will not enable it for one more second." My mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She had spent her entire adult life treating me like an afterthought, constantly prioritizing Brandon, constantly making excuses for his behavior, constantly demanding that I sacrifice my own happiness to ensure his comfort. She had traded her actual reliable daughter for a golden child who turned out to be nothing but a parasite. The realization was physically breaking her. Grandpa William turned his attention back to Brandon. The final judgment had not yet been delivered. "You thought you were very clever," Brandon Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You thought you could forge my signature on a $250,000 home equity loan, use the money to pay off your terrible debts, and then force your sister to cover your tracks with her inheritance. You thought this was just a family matter. You thought you could keep this entirely in-house." Brandon finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with absolute primal terror. "Grandpa, please," Brandon begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I am sorry. I was desperate. The private lenders were going to hurt me. I was going to figure out a way to pay the loan back. I just needed more time. Please do not take the house. Do not do this to me." "I am not doing anything to you, Brandon," Grandpa replied calmly. "You did this to yourself, and you are severely mistaken about the nature of your actions. Stealing your parents' retirement savings was a profound moral failure. But forging my signature on a bank document to secure a $250,000 loan is not a family disagreement." Grandpa William took a step backward, putting distance between himself and my brother. "It is a federal felony," Grandpa stated, pronouncing each word with absolute terrifying clarity. "It is mortgage fraud. It is wire fraud. It is identity theft. And it is grand larceny." The blood that had rushed to Brandon's face suddenly vanished. He looked like he was going to pass out. He swayed slightly on his feet, his hands gripping the eviction notice so tightly the paper crumpled. "You did not think I would simply rewrite my will and send you on your way, did you?" Grandpa asked, his tone devoid of any mercy. "When Jessica brought me the photographic evidence of your forged loan documents 3 weeks ago, I did not just call my estate attorney." Grandpa William turned his head and looked past the crowd of staring guests, directing his gaze toward the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the banquet hall. He gave a single sharp nod to the country club manager standing nervously near the exit. "I called the authorities," Grandpa announced. The heavy double doors swung open wide. 2 fully uniformed police officers stepped into the bright, silent ballroom. The sudden heavy thud of their tactical boots against the hardwood floor sounded like a drumbeat of absolute doom. The metallic clinking of their utility belts cut through the quiet room as they walked with brisk professional purpose directly toward the center of the crowd. The guests scrambled out of their way, their faces pale with shock. This was no longer a family drama. This was a criminal proceeding taking place in the middle of a high society birthday celebration. The reality of the situation crashed down on the room like an avalanche. My father let out a strangled gasp. He scrambled to his feet, holding his hands out in a desperate, futile gesture to stop the officers. "Wait," he pleaded, his voice thick with panic. "Officers, wait. This is a misunderstanding. This is a private family matter. We can resolve this internally." "Sir, step back immediately," the taller of the 2 officers commanded. His voice was firm, carrying the unquestionable authority of law enforcement. He placed his hand lightly on his utility belt A clear warning. Do not interfere. Step back now. My father froze his hands, trembling in the air. He looked at the officers, then looked at his son, his entire world completely and totally collapsing. He slowly lowered his hands and took a step back, finally realizing that he had absolutely no power left to protect his golden boy. The officers bypassed my father and walked straight up to Brandon. My brother looked like a cornered animal. He looked frantically at the exit doors, then at the tall windows, his mind desperately searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. He was surrounded by 50 witnesses, 2 police officers, and the undeniable truth of his own crimes. Brandon Myers, the taller officer, said, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. Yes, he whispered, the sound barely audible. The officer stepped directly into Brandon's personal space. You are under arrest for suspicion of felony mortgage fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny, the officer stated, reading the charges with a loud clinical precision that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. No, Brittany shrieked from across the room. She lunged forward, but 2 of her friends grabbed her arms, pulling her back and preventing her from interfering with the arrest. She collapsed against them, wailing loudly, her luxury lifestyle evaporating right before her eyes. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, the officer commanded. Brandon hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked at my mother, who was still kneeling in the spilled champagne, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. He looked at my father, who was standing, frozen tears streaming silently down his gray cheeks. Finally, Brandon looked at me. He expected to see gloating. He expected to see a triumphant, mocking smile. He expected me to rub his ultimate humiliation in his face. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I stood near the floral arrangement, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely neutral. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply watched him with the cold, analytical detachment of a bookkeeper auditing a closed account. He was no longer my brother. He was just a liability that had finally been balanced out of the ledger. Brandon slowly turned around. The second officer stepped forward, grabbing Brandon's arms and firmly pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around my brother's wrists echoed loudly across the ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a 30-year nightmare finally coming to an end. It was the sound of the invisible heavy chains of family obligation completely snapping. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. The taller officer pulled a small card from his front pocket and began reading the Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Every single word felt like a physical blow striking the foundation of my parents' toxic illusion. They had built their entire identities around this boy. They had allowed him to abuse me. They had demanded I surrender my future to fund his lies. And now they were being forced to watch as their perfect, successful son was formally read his rights in front of every single person they had ever tried to impress. The officers grasped Brandon by his upper arms and turned him toward the main exit. Walk, the officer commanded. The procession began. The 2 uniformed police officers marched my brother across the massive ballroom floor. Brandon kept his head bowed, staring at the intricate patterns on the carpet, unable to look at the 50 guests who were staring at him in complete, horrified silence. The whispers began as he passed the dining tables. I cannot believe it, a woman murmured. He stole from his own grandfather, a man whispered back in disgust. And he bankrupted his own parents, another voice added. The wealthy country club attendees. The people my mother had spent decades trying to impress were now serving as the ultimate jury. They looked at Brandon with sheer revulsion. They looked at my mother kneeling in her ruined dress with overwhelming pity. The social standing my parents had sacrificed me to maintain was permanently, entirely eradicated. They would never be able to show their faces in this town again. Brandon reached the heavy double doors. He stopped for one brief second and looked back over his shoulder. He looked at the wreckage he had caused. He looked at his sobbing wife, his ruined parents, and the grandfather who had finally held him accountable. Then the officers pushed him forward, marching him out of the bright, warm ballroom and into the cold, dark reality of the hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the sight of the golden boy in handcuffs. The silence in the room stretched out for a long, heavy minute. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew what to say. The entire atmosphere of the birthday celebration had been fundamentally shattered, replaced by the profound, heavy gravity of a crime scene. Grandpa William stood alone at the center of the dance floor. He slowly folded the 30-day eviction notice and placed it back into the thick manila folder. He smoothed his hands down the front of his tailored suit jacket, his posture remaining perfectly upright and unbroken. He turned his head and looked across the room, his eyes finding mine once again. The fierce, terrifying intensity had faded, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion, but also a quiet, undeniable pride. We had done exactly what we set out to do. We had exposed the rot. We had protected the innocent. We had ensured that the truth was permanently written into the history of our family. I looked down at the torn white envelope still clutched tightly in my right hand. The certified cashier's check for $145,000 was completely safe. It was mine. I had earned it through my own resilience, and I had protected it with my own courage. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs completely for the first time in my entire life. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations, the constant fear of Brandon's abuse, the endless toxic cycle of financial manipulation, it was all completely gone. The slate was wiped clean. The accounts were finally settled. I was entirely, wonderfully free. The passage of 6 months has a strange, almost magical way of clarifying the truth. Half a year has gone by since the heavy double doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club swung shut behind my brother. Half a year since the carefully constructed illusion of my family shattered into a million irreparable pieces on a polished hardwood floor. When the chaotic dust of that night finally settled, the brutal reality of Brandon's choices caught up with him in ways that no amount of smooth talking or parental protection could ever fix. The criminal justice system does not care about country club memberships. It does not care about custom-tailored suits or arrogant smiles. Because of the severity of the financial crimes and the sheer amount of money involved, local authorities handed the investigation over to federal prosecutors. Brandon is currently facing multiple federal felony charges. The indictments include mortgage fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The aggressive subprime lenders he thought he could outsmart tore apart his fake corporate entities like starving vultures. His highly publicized real estate empire was completely dismantled and liquidated by court-appointed trustees. He was forced to declare total devastating bankruptcy. He lost absolutely everything. His wife Brittany did not stick around to support him through his legal battles. The moment the police marched him out of the banquet hall, she realized her luxurious lifestyle was permanently over. She filed for divorce before his first preliminary court hearing, packing her expensive designer bags and rushing back to her own parents to hide from the overwhelming public disgrace. Brandon is now sitting in a county holding facility awaiting trial, looking at severe mandatory minimum prison sentences and crippling financial restitution fines that he will never be able to pay off in his lifetime. The golden boy is gone. All that remains is a convicted fraudster facing the absolute ruin of his own making. But the most profound tragedy of this entire ordeal did not belong to my brother. It belonged to the two people who had spent their entire lives enabling his terrible behavior. My parents, Richard and Susan, had to face the ultimate devastating consequence of their blind favoritism. When my grandfather revealed that Brandon had secretly drained their retirement accounts, my parents lost more than just their money. They lost their entire future. The quarterly financial statements they had trusted were complete fabrications. The reality was that their life savings were entirely gone. $412 was not nearly enough to sustain their comfortable, entitled suburban lifestyle. Without their retirement funds, they could no longer afford the massive mortgage on their pristine colonial house. They could not afford the country club dues. They could not afford the property taxes or the utility bills. Within 3 months, the bank foreclosed on the home I grew up in. I heard the details through the neighborhood grapevine. My parents were forced to pack 30 years of memories into cheap cardboard boxes and hold an embarrassing estate sale to liquidate their furniture. They had to sell my mother's expensive jewelry and my father's golf clubs just to afford a security deposit on a new place to live. They relocated to a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the far side of town. It is a loud, undesirable neighborhood located right next to a busy commercial highway. The supreme irony of their situation is almost poetic. For my entire adult life, my mother had relentlessly mocked my modest, independent apartment. She called it tiny and depressing. Now she's living in a space half the size of mine, completely stripped of the social status she valued above her own daughter. You would think that such a catastrophic betrayal by their favorite child would make them realize the terrible mistakes they had made. You would think it would prompt a genuine moment of self-reflection. But toxic people rarely change. Instead of accepting responsibility for their own willful ignorance, they simply shifted their desperate expectations onto me. The phone calls started about 4 weeks after the birthday party. At first, I just watched my phone light up with my mother's contact name. I did not answer. Then the voicemails began to accumulate. I sat at my kitchen table one evening drinking a cup of warm tea and listened to the messages on speakerphone. "Jessica, please pick up the phone," my mother sobbed in the first voicemail. Her voice was thick with manufactured tears. "We are really struggling right now. The move was so expensive, and your father is having trouble finding a job at his age. We know things got a little out of hand at the party, but we are still a family. We need you." 2 days later, my father left a message. "Jessica, we need to talk. Your brother made some terrible mistakes, but we are the ones paying the ultimate price. You walked away from that night with a massive trust fund check. You have over $140,000 just sitting in the bank. We just need a small loan, a bridge to help us survive the next few months until we can get back on our feet. You do not have a family to support. You owe it to us to help." They were not calling to apologize for the years of emotional abuse. They were not calling to apologize for watching my brother slap me across the face and blaming me for the violence. They were calling because I was the only bank account they had left to drain. They wanted to replace Brandon the parasite with Jessica the savior. They wanted me to fund their survival using the very inheritance they had tried to force me to give to the man who ruined them. I sat in my quiet, peaceful apartment and felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no sorrow, no guilt. The emotional cord that tied me to their approval had been completely severed. I picked up my smartphone, navigated to my settings, and permanently blocked both of their phone numbers. I blocked their email addresses. I blocked their social media profiles. I wrapped them in a blanket of absolute, impenetrable, dead silence. I did not send a final text message. I did not offer a dramatic farewell speech. They did not deserve any more of my words or my energy. I simply erased them from my reality. The liberation I felt in that moment was intoxicating. I was finally breathing clean air. With the toxic weight of my family completely removed from my shoulders, I turned my full attention toward the future I had always dreamed of building. The Monday following the country club disaster, I walked into my local bank branch and securely deposited the certified cashier's check for $145,000. I did not spend the money on a luxury car. I did not buy an expensive wardrobe or book a lavish vacation to show off on the internet. I used that capital to build a solid, unshakable foundation for my professional life. I officially resigned from my corporate bookkeeping job. I filed the necessary legal paperwork to establish my own independent bookkeeping and financial consulting firm. I spent weeks scouting commercial real estate, finally finding the perfect location. I signed a lease on a beautiful sunlit office space in a thriving business district downtown. I painted the walls a calming shade of pale gray. I bought a solid oak desk, comfortable client chairs, and state-of-the-art financial software. When the heavy glass door of my office was finally installed, Featuring my name elegantly stenciled in silver lettering across the center, I stood in the hallway and cried tears of pure, unadulterated joy. My business grew rapidly. Small business owners needed an accountant they could trust, someone who could look at their ledgers and tell them the absolute truth without sugarcoating the numbers. My reputation for meticulous honesty became my greatest marketing tool. Within 4 months, my client roster was completely full. I was not just surviving anymore. I was thriving on my own terms. I was not the only one who experienced a massive positive transition. Grandpa William also made a profound change in his life. After the legal dust settled, and Brandon was formally evicted from the suburban property, Grandpa William placed the massive house on the real estate market. The property sold quickly for a substantial profit. Grandpa told me that walking through those empty halls had made him realize how much unnecessary space he was maintaining. The grand house had become a monument to broken promises and a family that no longer existed. He took the profits from the sale and purchased a stunning single-story luxury condominium just 3 blocks away from my new downtown office. The condominium building is secure, beautifully maintained, and surrounded by vibrant city life. Grandpa traded the quiet isolation of the suburbs for the energetic hum of the city. He joined a local chess club. He started attending historical lectures at the nearby university. He looks 10 years younger, his posture straighter, his eyes brighter without the heavy burden of my parents' constant demands. Our relationship has blossomed into the most beautiful connection of my life. We are no longer just a grandfather and a granddaughter connected by shared genetics. We are survivors who protected each other. Every single Sunday evening, without fail, we share a dinner together. Sometimes we cook a quiet meal in the pristine kitchen of his new condominium. Sometimes we walk to a fantastic Italian restaurant down the street from my office. We talk about my growing business. We talk about the books he is reading. We talk about everything except the people we left behind. We do not mention Brandon. We do not mention Susan or Richard. They belong to a different lifetime. Last Sunday, as we sat across from each other at his dining table, drinking hot coffee and eating slices of warm apple pie, Grandpa William reached across the table and patted my hand. "You built a beautiful life, Jessica," he said softly, his wise eyes crinkling at the corners. "You took a terrible storm and used the rain to grow a garden. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you are." I looked around his comfortable, peaceful home, thinking about my thriving business and the absolute quiet of my blocked phone. I smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to my soul. "We built it together, Grandpa," I replied. "I am finally free. I am no longer the overlooked spinster. I am no longer the disposable safety net for a family that prioritized a golden illusion over genuine love. I am an independent, successful woman who knows the exact value of her own peace." If you are watching this video and you have ever felt like the invisible scapegoat in your own family, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your future to people who treat you like a burden. You do not have to sacrifice your financial stability, your mental health, or your happiness just to keep the peace for toxic people who refuse to save themselves. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. Walking away from abuse is not an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You have every right to protect your peace and build a life that belongs entirely to you. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future stories about finding justice and taking back your life. I would love to know where you are joining from today, so please drop a comment with your location and the time you are watching this video. Let me know if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your own happiness. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and always trust your instincts. I often sit in the quiet warmth of my new downtown office after all my staff members have gone home for the evening. The city lights flicker to life outside my large glass window, casting a gentle, glowing reflection across the solid oak desk I bought with my own hard-earned money. In those silent and peaceful moments, my mind inevitably drifts back to the dark corridor of the country club and the heavy mahogany door of my father's study. I think about the scared, exhausted woman I used to be. I think about the dutiful daughter who was constantly shrinking herself to fit into the tiny, insignificant box my parents had constructed for me. For 30 years, I operated under a deeply flawed and incredibly painful assumption. I truly believed that love was a transactional currency. I thought that if I was simply accommodating enough, quiet enough, and generous enough with my time and my resources, my parents would eventually wake up and realize my actual value. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was the ultimate family virtue, even if it meant absorbing my brother's cruel insults and completely surrendering my own personal boundaries. But surviving the devastating fallout of my brother's financial crimes taught me a profound and unshakable truth. Looking back, I realized that yielding to the unreasonable demands of toxic family members never buys you their love. It only buys you more exploitation. People who view you as a convenient resource do not magically transform into loving parents or caring siblings just because you hand them your hard-earned money. They simply learn that you are willing to bleed, so they do not have to feel any discomfort. When you give them your compliance, they do not feel gratitude. They feel an absolute entitlement to take even more. Keeping the peace is a lie we tell ourselves to justify our own ongoing suffering. When we bite our tongues and write the checks, the peace we are keeping belongs entirely to the abuser. We are simply swallowing the war and internalizing the conflict so the toxic people in our lives can remain comfortable in their delusions. I am a professional bookkeeper. I spend my days dealing in absolute facts in detailed ledgers and in clear credits and debits. I have learned that the emotional ledger of a family is far more critical than any printed bank statement. My parents' emotional ledger was fundamentally bankrupt long before my brothers stole their actual retirement funds. They invested everything they had into a fantasy. They poured all their blind devotion into a golden son who viewed them only as a stepping stone. They treated me as an endless line of emotional credit, assuming I would always be there to absorb his debts and cover his failures. When I finally cut them off and closed my account, they had absolutely nothing left in their reserves. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to really hear me. I want you to look back at your own life and examine your own ledgers. How many times have you swallowed your own needs just to avoid an argument at a holiday dinner? How many times have you written a check or sacrificed your own savings for a relative who never intended to pay you back simply because you felt trapped by the heavy obligation of that word family? We exhaust ourselves trying to fill a bottomless pit of their mistakes. We convince ourselves that standing up for our own security is a selfish act. We let toxic relatives call us ungrateful or cold. But standing up for yourself and protecting your assets is not selfish. It is pure, simple survival. My brother was willing to let me lose my entire inheritance to cover up his federal crimes. My parents were perfectly willing to let me sacrifice my financial stability to save their golden child from a prison cell. If I had not drawn a hard, immovable line in the sand, they would have pulled me down into the exact same ruin that eventually consumed them. There is a profound difference between money and dignity. Money is just a tool. It can be spent, it can be lost, and it can be earned back again through hard work and dedication. My grandfather built his wealth with his bare hands, and he was prepared to watch his property go into foreclosure rather than let a lying thief inherit his legacy. Money can be replaced, but your dignity and peace of mind cannot. Once you surrender your self-respect to appease a toxic family member, you lose a fundamental piece of your soul. You cannot easily earn back the years you spent making yourself small just to make an abuser feel tall. You cannot put a price tag on the absolute quiet of a life lived without manipulation. Waking up in the morning and knowing that your phone is not going to ring with a manufactured crisis is a luxury that no amount of money can buy. I sleep soundly every single night. I do not worry about my brother stealing from my accounts. I do not worry about my mother screaming at me for failing to solve problems I did not create. I am completely safe because I finally chose myself. Do not wait for a massive catastrophe to set your own boundaries. Do not wait for someone to steal your retirement funds or physically strike you across the face before you realize you have the absolute right to walk away. You hold the power right now. You are allowed to protect your home, your bank accounts, and your heart from anyone who tries to drain them, no matter what title they hold on a birth certificate. I see so many people who have worked their entire lives dedicating 50 or 60 years to honest labor, only to have their twilight years ruined by entitled relatives. They hand over their pensions to bail out grown children who refuse to take responsibility for their own actions. They let toxic siblings dictate their emotional state. They carry a heavy burden of guilt, believing that a good person must always forgive and forget. But true forgiveness does not mean giving someone the keys to your house so they can rob you a second time. True forgiveness is making peace with the past while firmly locking the door to the future. You have the ultimate authority to close those accounts. You can stop the transfers of your energy, your time, and your wealth today. It will be painful at first. The guilt trips will be loud and the accusations will be vicious. But once you step through the fire of their anger, you will find a beautiful, quiet landscape waiting for you on the other side. You will find a life where you are surrounded by people who respect your boundaries and value your presence. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If you have ever had to draw a hard line with people who called themselves family, just to protect your own peace, please share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss our next story about finding justice. Until next time, remember you deserve to be respected.